Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adele Webb. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra, and it's my great pleasure to be convening tonight's event. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to elders past to present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people who are joining us in the room tonight. As the book by Adam Goodes teaches the next generation of Australians, they said it was nobody's land, but it was somebody's land. Land and connection to land lies at the heart of First Nations stories, laws, and truths. But land and struggle for land is also a central theme in Australia's settler colonial narrative. The mythology that persists about an egalitarian society inhabiting an empty continent, settlers whose sweat and labour forged an unmediated connection to a historyless land. Such discursive constructions of Australia as a settler colonial nation not only erase Indigenous histories and the history of dispossession, but they also risk marginalising migrant histories and the role that migrants have played in Australia's story. They make our story of nationhood stubborn and rigid, disinclined to acknowledge complexity, conflict and transformation. Yet transformation is well underway in Australia. Australia is one of the most multicultural countries in the world. These realities challenge us to reimagine our national story, our institutions and our democratic system, not as fixed and static, but as evolving. So on that note, we're very privileged this evening to be joined by an outstanding panel of thinkers and doers who will help us to explore our central theme, democratic representation in a multicultural society. And before I hand over to our moderator for this evening, Professor Chris Wallace, I'd just like to briefly situate tonight's conversation within the broader work of the Centre for Deliberative Democracy. So this event forms part of one of our flagship initiatives, Connecting to Parliament, which is a project dedicated to translating deliberative democracy research into practical reforms aimed at strengthening representative democracy in Australia. And one important strand of that work focuses on the intersections between multiculturalism, belonging and democracy. And in just a few weeks, we'll be hosting a day-long deliberative workshop at the Museum of Australian Democracy with young people from multicultural backgrounds in Canberra. And together with them, we'll be exploring questions of belonging, identity, and how these young people understand and experience their place in Australian democracy. But tonight is about public dialogue, and we're in for a rich one. I'm grateful to my colleague Chris Wallace for agreeing to guide our discussion. Chris brings deep insights into Australian politics, drawn both from her academic expertise and her career as a journalist in the Canberra Press Gallery. So the ideal person to moderate tonight's panel. So with that, it's my great pleasure to hand over to you, Chris, to introduce our panellists and open the discussion.
Thanks very much, Adele. And thanks, Celine, for the invitation tonight. The Centre for Deliberative Democracy, I'm sure most of you understand what it is, but for those who don't, it's the jewel in the crown at the University of Canberra. It's our most important centre for thought leadership in this phenomenally crucial democratic political space, and we're all very grateful for your efforts, and long may they continue and be properly funded. This is one of a number of incredible events that the Centre has put on, and the dividends for our community directly here, but also for the broader Australian polity, can't be underestimated. So thank you, and thank you for all being part of it tonight. And I know many of you are repeat attenders. Keep coming. We've got a wonderful panel tonight, a couple of colleagues and a non-colleague, but you never know in the future. You never know. Associate Professor David Nolan at the end is an Associate Professor at the School of Arts and Communication at the University of Canberra and a member of the News and Media Research Centre. You do extraordinary work too. You're tied up with the Oxford Reuters Centre, aren't you? Quite heavily in research terms.
Via the digital newsroom.
There you go. Emily Foley is a research fellow with the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and at Flinders University in Melbourne. That's not right. Flinders University or Melbourne University? Flinders? Wow, South Australia?
Yep.
Where from exactly?
I think living in Melbourne.
Right.
Flinders.
Yeah, that's a very Canberra thing, isn't it? Multimodal. And Ilo Diaz works with communities directly affected by discriminatory practices in Melbourne and is an advocate for justice and accountability. He's one of the founders of the Centre Against Racial Profiling. Welcome all tonight. Now, anyone who's seen the news tonight would have seen the horror of Donald Trump, US President, declaring that people from whole nations were not welcome in the US anymore and would be forbidden entry. Quote, "We don't want them." Just to kick off tonight, can I have a personal reaction from each of you to the news out of the US tonight, and also a general take on how you think Donald Trump's war against inclusion in US politics is impacting our own politics? David, can we start with you? Tough question, I know.
Well, I mean, it's tough in the sense that I haven't been following the news as such. But look, it's. I mean, you know, the experience of Trump, I think, is one that is both kind of, you know, one has this kind of dual feeling all the time of being unsurprised but shocked at the same time. You know, because, you know, it leaves you aghast, the things that he comes out with on a daily basis. And it's of a piece with attacks that have been going on for some time. So, you know, I mean, one of the first things that he did upon becoming president, it was, you know, was to sign an executive order, you know, banning diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives from all government departments in America, positioning them as illegal and immoral discrimination. And I think it's kind of quite significant to think about that positioning, like how he's positioning it as illegal and immoral discrimination, that he's positioning inclusion, equity and inclusion efforts that have really come from a history of trying to combat inequality, combat discrimination, positioning those as a source of discrimination. And that's very much in line with the kind of, I guess, this kind of rhetoric of kind of that this is a threat to white people, effectively. You know, that is a kind of white victimhood narrative. So we say that he says that he doesn't want to come to our country, but he's not happy to welcome white South Africans that he claims are being discriminated against in their country. So, and like we've seen a lot more, you know, the comments around wildfires as being DEI being to blame because apparently the hires were made onto these.
So let's just pause there. You've used an acronym, and we all as academics love an acronym. But some people don't know what
equity and inclusion.
Thank you, and that's and
diversity, equity, and inclusion.
That's right, and that's the usual acronym used in the US, isn't it? DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and it's been adopted more and more here. Do you think that kind of Trumpian attack, the war on DEI, is playing in Australia?
Yes and no. So I think it's being heard in Australia. It's being amplified in some quarters, some areas of the press, and certain media outlets that operate after dark. So you know but I don't think that's a particular surprise. In terms of the way in which they played out, I mean, we saw Dutton take up that kind of anti-diversity theme prior to the election, where he talked about, you know, Canberra waste, kind of really picking up on that sort of Trumpian rhetoric of, you know, talking about DEI as immense waste, where he positioned it. So Canberra waste, where he talked about the public service, he talked particularly about diversity, equity and inclusion advisors as not doing anything for ordinary Australians. So that rhetoric, that rhetoric has been in the public sphere. There have in recent years been there have been surveys that have shown that diversity has been losing support as a concept. So I think those politics have had an impact. At the same time, we are a different state. And, so the degree to, I guess two things. One, I think that that rhetoric was fairly roundly dismissed through the election, right? Like it was not a successful campaigning point. So,
so that's good news, right?
That is definitely good news. So I think that, whilst we shouldn't rest on our laurels about that, it is good news. And I think the other thing is that Australia has a different political and legal system. A lot of diversity programs really are have been impelled by anti-discrimination workplace laws, which are not going to come under threat in the same way because we have a stronger separation of powers effectively.
Emily, how are you feeling about the Trumpian war on inclusion? Is it impacting here?
I mean, wait. Okay, we're good. I mean, maybe rather than talk about necessarily some of the sort of war on inclusion, well, essentially it is. But the announcement for today, I do have a feeling on this, and I was actually complaining about this today to a couple of people. So sorry that you're going to have to hear this if you're in the crowd for the second time today. But my other hat, on the weekends, I, alongside two other amazing South Sudanese women, we run a voluntary not-for-profit, which is a homework, tutoring, mentoring, support club for South Sudanese folk, young kids in particular, across Melbourne and Sydney. And that's been running since 2001, since the first wave of South Sudanese refugees came, mostly single mums and kids who had been displaced twice from conflict and were either at risk or had experienced sexual violence. And they walked around Melbourne University putting up ads all around the university asking for help for their kids to go to learn English. And that grew, right? And so then now we've got 5 campuses in Melbourne and 1 in Sydney. And the reason why I'm saying all of this is that in the last 10 sort of years since the sort of African gains fervour, what we've seen is that there have been no new South Sudanese migrants that have been coming in. And that's been deprioritised essentially, and we've heard it quietly, that there have been murmurs that Border Force have been deprioritising, putting at the bottom of the list South Sudanese refugees, because even though they're coming from one of the countries in the most need, so most of these folks are coming from camps in either Kakuma or Uganda or in Egypt, so displaced twice, they're still being deprioritised. And that's a political move that has not. Yeah, I didn't get a notification today from ABC News saying Albanese or Morrison have decided to deprioritise, but that's still sort of happening here. So I guess that's what I was thinking today. It's a horror. We're in a workshop today and you get this notification, you go, oh my, but we are seeing similar types of the politicisation of migration has always been a thing, and it will continue to be. Yeah.
So it's not necessarily upfront and open here, but it's well entrenched.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, so we've got to keep our eyes open and be more searching about what's going on. And my inner journalist says, bring on the FOIs, right? Yeah. Is that being pursued at all? Do you know?
No, I think I've actually spoken to some former public servant folks who have turned academic who can help. There's an FOI whiz, I think potentially who's here, who I might speak to properly about this. I have a feeling it'll be classified, but we could try.
I think it's very important what you just pointed out, that we are actually kind of early adopters and prosecutors of such ideologies in a very ugly way. And if it's silent, all the more reason to be diligent in searching out what the hell is going on and doing something about it. Ilo, Trump, Australia. How are you feeling?
I try not to think about Trump.
But, it's hard to miss, isn't it? It's so terrible. I'm sure everyone on this stage tonight has given thought to whether they'll be flying into the US anytime soon, for example.
No, they already don't want me. I don't know how to answer that question because one, I was driving up to Canberra from Melbourne all day, so I missed the news. But secondly, it just feels if like the work I do is really it's gonna. I don't want it to sound exclusionary, but it's very on the ground, and so a lot of the times Trump is in the atmosphere, but it doesn't penetrate to the work that we do. Like the work is what do people need? What are the needs on the ground? And so we get that rhetoric and we get that dialogue and all those conversations that the political elite and the media are having. And I think the effects that I feel that I see are on the ground, everyday racism, building of more barriers for people to get justice. It seeps into the systemic issues that already exist in a racist Australia, right? So it compounds with what is already existing, but
look, that's a beautiful pivot because we want to hear about what you're doing on the ground. Tell us about your work on the ground in terms of racial profiling, because I'm sure this is going to be quite shocking to some people here.
Sure. I'll quickly start that I work with the community. So I work at a community legal service in Melbourne. It's a small, tiny little community legal service. I'm not a lawyer. I always preface that. I work with the community. So my work predominantly I work with North Melbourne and Flemington residents. These are public housing residents. They're the big towers that you see when you drive into Melbourne. And I'll just want to point out 3 things. Dates. The 4th of December, 2017. Milo Yiannopoulos. Anyone know Milo Yiannopoulos? Far right extremist, rhetoric, disgusting, racist. He comes to Melbourne under a cloud of controversy and sets up his speech right in front of the flats, what we call the flats, the high rise. Now, these high rise, multicultural community, mostly from the Horn of Africa. He comes in and he's talking about Islamophobia, racism, misogyny, the lot, right? Bunch of great, what you want, rat bag lefties all come down and protest. The community comes down and protests. Essentially, there's a clash. Milo leaves. The rat bag lefties leave, and what happens is that evening, those flats get raided by the police because the police see this community who have just been hurled racial and racist abuse as the enemy, as the ones where the threat is coming from. We got lots and lots of evidence that night that police would come in, arrest, and harass the young people, right, inside their homes. Second, 4th of July, 2020, hard lockdown in Melbourne. Those same flats get hard lockdown. Flemington, North Melbourne get hard lockdown. The hard lockdown is immediate. From the moment 4:30 p.m., I remember 4:30 p.m., the Premier comes down and says hard lockdown. That night, that evening, 5 o'clock, I was getting phone calls that there was police outside, 500 police outside locking people down. It was unprecedented. 5 days for most of those flats, another flat for an extra 5 days. Food, medicine, it was chaos. I was down there. Many of us were down there. It was chaos. It was absolutely chaos. They had no idea what they were doing. And this community were caged, everybody was under lockdown, but these guys, there had to be an extra step, right? There was one incident, I'll quickly mention one incident. They hadn't had fresh air for 10 days. For 5 days. And so the police set up a cage downstairs, and in police escort, in groups of 5, they came down, and the ombudsman came out and said they felt like they were back in the refugee camps, being caged again. Ombudsman did an investigation, human rights were violated. Can the government apologise? We're still waiting for the government to apologise. The final day, and I'll end on this, I don't remember the exact date, but October 2023, the demolition of their homes was announced. So all flats in all the high rises in Melbourne are being demolished, but the first ones to go are the ones in Flemington and North Melbourne. About 3,000 residents need to be moved out of their homes and relocated. And that process is what we're working with right now, has been absolute shambles. Families being torn apart, families of 5 or 6 family members being put into 2 different houses, being moved out into the outer suburbs. Why? So that we can bring down those flats and build social housing for new families, aka white families. So inclusion in democracy, what has this got to do? I've had residents and people come up to me and say, we're not marginalized. We're not on the margins of this. We're not disenfranchised. We're targeted. It doesn't feel like we're disenfranchised. It feels like we're actively targeted and they're coming after us. So what does that mean for democracy? This generation growing up, the ones that grew up having been raided, having been locked up, and now their homes being demolished, when they grow up and they become active citizens in our society, what does that mean when they feel right now that they're being actively targeted by the state?
Well, in our ivory towers, we would theorise that horrific situation that you've described, that series of awful moments that reflect the deeper reality, would lead to some people politically activating, getting pre-selection, getting elected to the local council, getting pre-selection for a state seat, even if they didn't win it, going for a federal seat. You know, is there a kind of institutional democratic response from the grassroots up in a situation like that you've observed, or is it mission impossible? If so, why?
The system's not for them, is what I hear. This is not for me. This system that works against us and targets us is not my system. The community are vibrant and resilient and strong. They stood up to Milo. They stood up to the COVID lockdown. They did their own food relief program. When the state was failing them, they created their own food relief program during COVID. And right now they're resisting the demolition. They do their own work. It's just not that the system doesn't represent them. In fact, it actively targets them.
And do you see novel democratic forms rising up from their collective action? Is it, you know, what can we learn from this?
Yeah, look, I don't come with answers.
You might have observations about how people are organised.
I think there's a lot of interesting politics around it, but the community, it feels like when the community do go for some political, you know, activation and like the traditional sense, it feels like they get knocked back very quickly because they're surrounded by, you know, these are islands in Melbourne. These are islands of really diverse communities that know each other and understand each other. But when you go up for pre-selection or for council or for councillor role, you've got the wider electorate to think about, and they don't know you. They haven't gone and lived in public housing. They're not hanging out in the same gym that you hang out in. They're not going to the same mosque that you pray at. They're not going to the same restaurants that you go to. And so it does feel like there's a systemic blockage right there.
So the representatives in the official formal systems have never lived this reality, don't know it exists probably, most of them, and therefore how unsurprising that policies don't arise that can address their realities. Emily, a lot of your scholarly work focuses on migrant communities. What's your observations on this?
Well, so for some context, I finished my PhD probably about, I can't say how long until you can stop saying recently. So I finished my PhD, but the kind of beginning of all of it is that my family are Uruguayan. We came in the 1970s, in 1975, when Whitlam brought us over on assisted migration. And this is kind of comes back to this point. Migration has always been politicized, right? So Whitlam brought a lot of South American migrants who were fleeing military dictatorships during that period. And we brought everyone. My mum used to get pulled out of school every Friday to sit with my grandma every week to fill out all the forms, to bring in more folk, to sponsor everyone. My whole family here, right? And then my partner is an Italian migrant worker, and I was doing a lot of hospitality, and I was speaking to all of these people, and many of them had been here for 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years with no voting rights, paying taxes, no access to citizenship, and no pathway to citizenship. And so I started to do my PhD looking at the sort of politics around temporary migrant workers, and I was really interested in particular in how the Labor Party dealing with this issue or grappling with this issue, because we had about 2.5 million migrant workers in Australia just before COVID who were not paying taxes, who were paying taxes but didn't have any sort of, real political rights to be able to exercise some form of agency. And I've forgotten your question after that whole rant that I've just been on. But the point of representation, that's the right. Yeah. So what I do think has happened in the last couple of years is that we've seen actually some good things have been happening in the last government. I did a presentation on this a few months ago. I went and looked at, every single thing that the Labor Party have done in the last 3 years or so on migration. There's some amazing things in terms of raising the minimum threshold for wages for skilled migrants, in terms of Australia has the first ever migrant worker exploitation visa. Like, it's world leading what's been happening. Increasing pathways to permanent residency and citizenship for New Zealanders in particular, which is one of the biggest groups if we're talking about disenfranchisement. However, it's sort of shrouded in this whole language of migration being a security issue. I actually think I remember, did you, Chris, do the 2001 cabinet papers?
Yeah, I did that.
Yeah, I do.
2000. Wow,
You did.
memory.
Yeah. Well, was it? Yeah, I think you're in my PhD. So you did the 2001 security, and this is when migration started to become a security issue. It became a national security issue, and Labor have never managed to rid itself of that. So Labor can never talk about migration and talk about some of the achievements in terms of security for workers, citizenship for workers, voting rights. It can talk about it in terms of numbers, housing, threats, etc. So what we saw in the last few years is maybe many of you are thinking, well, I didn't actually know that a lot of these things happened. And that's because what has shrouded all of that is migrant numbers being too high. We need to cut them, students, etc., etc., etc. What does that mean? I mean, I just think that it means that we can have all of these strong policies in terms of securing migrants' well-being, citizenship, etc. But when the broader narrative views them as a problem, I think political parties play into that. People or a lot of the community that I work with on the ground do not see themselves as being able to go into Parliament. I mean, that's not even a question for some. Maybe for folks that have had their parents were migrants, and they've had the opportunity to go to university. They go in there. One of the young youth wings have been able to grab them and get them. But in terms of folks that were not born here and that are really struggling to make ends meet, that can't go to the branch catch-ups in pubs at the quiz at the pub or politics at the pub because they're either working or they're looking after their 6-7 siblings. Yeah, it's not possible. Anyway, sorry.
Look, that's great that you brought up securitisation. I was the cabinet historian for the 2000 and 2001 cabinet papers, and the big thing about that period under the Howard government arising from September 11 and what happened in the US and what we then consequently signed up for is the securitisation of everything. So we're not aware of this, but if you can it's a hard thing to do, to think back before the turn of the century to a time where literally every single policy issue was not seen through the lens of national security. And the same is true of neoliberalism. And my work currently focuses on the neoliberal aspect of that. But I liken it to, the old joke about two fish meeting in the pond. One fish says to the other, "The water's cold today." And the first fish says, "What's water?" Right? So we're a quarter of a century into this period of being totally soaked in neoliberalism, totally soaked in the securitisation mindset. We are not aware of it. I think one of the big, so many scholars are chiseling away at trying to get the light bulb moment going off for everyone. So go, Emily. Can you please keep making that point in public and private often? David, your scholarly, and we'll get to questions straight after David's contribution to this next question. You've worked a lot on kind of a potentially good news story, Indigenous journalists in newsrooms, something that as a journalist myself, I never ever experienced. So that's been a big change in the last 10, 20 years that's even a thing. I'm taking it's a pretty challenging experience. Can you tell us a bit about what your research has found in that area, good and bad?
So I mean, I think the good, is a good place to start, in the sense that, I think what is good is that there is a much greater presence of Indigenous journalists. That's what you've recognised there, and that is, that has been making change in kind of in Indigenous representation in newsrooms. So I think that's been, so there's been incredible stories. I mean, just to, if we think, for example, about what Lorena Allen's been doing at The Guardian, the deaths inside, and the work she's done on sort of on massacres, like incredible pieces of journalism, the work that Bridget Brennan's been doing at the ABC, etc. So that's really fantastic. On the sort of more challenging front, so the piece of work that I did that kind of then flowed into the current work that I'm doing was around talking to Indigenous journalists working in newsrooms about their experiences, and the name of that article that we ended up writing was called "It's Trauma on a Deadline." And that was and the title was a quote from one of the journalists, and it captured two things. One, they were talking at the time about having to write constantly about their own community's trauma and what that did to them, but it also was relevant to the themes of the experience of being Indigenous journalists in white newsrooms, because those were themselves traumatic spaces, and traumatic spaces because they were experiencing daily microaggressions. They were being told that they were diversity hires, that they were being given extra kind of cultural load, and at times kind of being racially exploited by colleagues without any extra recompense, and there was just generally this kind of expectation on them of kind of burden of representation, diversity work, whilst at the same time, disempowerment of being able to kind of put forward their own agendas a lot. So, and this was kind of, it came back to kind of white news values. Effectively, what was seen as newsworthy was, what was seen as appealing to the audience. So I recall one particular example where a journalist was talking about, it was the first day of the UROC Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Victoria, and this journalist wanted to write about it and was basically going to their editor, and their editor was basically saying to them, "That's not news. Like that's not of interest to our audience." And and I remember them saying to me, imagine, if it was comparing it to the coronation of King Charles, right? This is this kind of scale of kind of moment that this is for Indigenous people in Victoria, but there is no access to representation for people. Now, for people that kind of were brought in during that period on a promise that, this was an avenue to greater representation, following, and this was very much kind of a set of kind of hiring that happened after Black Lives Matters. This is just incredibly dispiriting, alienating, and ultimately that drip over time ends up being traumatic. And that's
that's such a great example. Questions, please come up to the microphone, start queuing up. What you've just described is really important. I teach a unit in our Master of Public Policy at UC called Equity, Leadership and Policy. And the first exercise I set for students is to crisply tell me the difference between diversity, equity and inclusion, which most people lump all in one. David, your example is so great. Diversity, there are Indigenous journalists in the newsroom, but diversity is just a metric. The situation you found in your research was there wasn't equity, there was not fairness for them once they were in the newsroom, and there certainly wasn't inclusion. They weren't making decisions. They weren't influencing the news agenda. They weren't making the news judgments. It's so important for everyone to take to heart that diversity is the necessary but not sufficient condition for a fair society. You've got to have equity, fairness. You've got to have inclusion, and that's where the listening, taking in, taking notice and acting upon people's views, not just, having the metric ticked off, really important.